Good morning, I'm Diane Macedo. Today on ABC News Live, a judge is set to hear arguments today on whether to unseal the affidavit behind the search of former President Trump's Florida estate. It comes as one of Trump's most trusted executives has pleaded guilty in a New York tax fraud case, and as former Vice President Mike Pence speaks out. What he's saying now about threats against the FBI. The CDC director is promising a major overhaul after a scathing report found the agency repeatedly botched its pandemic response. What we know about the report's findings and the changes on the way. And millions of Americans are on alert for extreme weather, including record flash flooding in the Southwest and fire danger in the West. Why the forecast is making it even more dangerous. But we begin with a federal judge in Florida hearing arguments today on whether to unseal the affidavit behind the search of former President Trump's Florida estate. Trump has demanded its full release, and ABC News and other media organizations have requested that parts of it be unsealed. But the Justice Department says that could jeopardize the investigation. ABC News investigative reporter Catherine Falders is live outside the federal courthouse in West Palm Beach, Florida, with the latest. Catherine, media organizations have argued that the affidavit could be unsealed with redactions. So what is the Justice Department saying in response to that?
Well, look, DOJ in a filing said that they oppose this affidavit being released. They said that it could compromise future investigations, ongoing investigations, potential cooperation of witnesses who they haven't secured yet. They say it's a matter of national security. They don't think that this should be released in full. Now, they did say that if there was some decision to unseal this with redactions, that they would like to, DOJ would like to do that in tandem with the judge to make sure none of that information compromises any ongoing investigation or any intelligence here. Look, news organizations say that we want this public. There are arguments in court that that we're willing to have redactions, for example, here. But given the public nature of this case, that Trump himself announced the warrant on his home. You heard the Attorney General come out and say that this was unprecedented, and there's been lots of public discussion about it. So that's why the warrant was released. That's why the accompanying documents were released with the materials that were taken from Trump's home. So, of course, this is the argument to have the affidavit, or at least portions of it, released to the public.
So how long before we get a ruling on this, and what are the different ways this can play out?
There's a lot of different scenarios here. Look, we could get a ruling today. A lot of legal experts say that it's unlikely that the judge will just rule to unseal this affidavit. It rarely happens in any cases here, given the secret nature of it. But something could come today on this. What we will hear are arguments from both sides, from DOJ, from media organizations, including ABC News. We could learn more from prosecutors and from the Department of Justice about that raid at Mar-a-Lago. That could give us more clues, for example. But again, if there is a scenario where the judge says that he wants portions of this released, it's unlikely that we would see that today. They would likely have to go through a period where information is redacted so it didn't compromise any witnesses or any intelligence or any future and ongoing investigations.
Now, some allies of the former president are calling on him to release surveillance footage from Mar-a-Lago during the raid. That's separate from the surveillance footage that agents have seized. So what do we know about those respective videos?
Yeah, so the video that agents have seized from Mar-a-Lago came in response to a subpoena that was issued to the Trump Organization in June. That subpoena requested video from Mar-a-Lago, 60 days worth of video, we're told, specifically related to the surveillance of these materials, of these boxes, once DOJ learned that there were more materials there. Now, that video is in the possession of federal investigators. The video that Trump and his allies have talked about, separate from that video I just talked about related to the subpoena, they're threatening to release video related to the raid of his property. You've heard some of his lawyers go on television saying that they want the names of these agents released. They want their identities revealed. That is essentially the argument that his attorneys are making on television. So this video that they're referring to is the video that's specific to the raid of his house with those federal agents that occurred. Now, we know DOJ has said that they've expressed concern, not specifically about this video, for example, but they've expressed concern about warrants being released with names of agents on them because they're concerned about their safety.
All right, Catherine Falder's in West Palm Beach for us. Thanks, Catherine. Meanwhile, the Trump Organization's former chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, has pleaded guilty to tax charges in New York today. New video shows him leaving court. The charges are part of a New York City criminal investigation into the real estate company's business practices. Senior investigative reporter Aaron Katersky is live outside the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse with more on this. Aaron, what happened in court today, and what's the latest on this plea deal that Weisselberg made with prosecutors?
Diane, Alan Weisselberg sat at the defense table, faced the judge, and at each of 15 counts, he entered a plea of guilty, and he had to answer repeatedly, "Yes, Your Honor," when the judge asked him a series of questions about the crimes that he committed, including conspiracy and grand larceny, falsifying business records. Each and every time, when asked whether that was true, Alan Weisselberg said, "Yes, Your Honor." Weisselberg, as part of this plea agreement with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, agreed to spend 5 months on Rikers Island, the notorious New York City jail complex. He also will then spend 5 years under supervised release, and he needs to pay back all of the taxes that he avoided through this compensation scheme that he engineered at the Trump Organization by paying executives, including himself, off the books. Weisselberg is going to have to pay back almost $2 million in back taxes and penalties. He also has agreed to waive any appeal of what amounts to this conviction now on 15 different tax charges.
So what's Weisselberg's legal team saying about this?
Well, in a statement just now, his attorney, Nick Gravanti, said that this was one of the most difficult decisions that Weisselberg has ever made, but he wanted to put these years of what he called a nightmare behind him. He had faced the possibility of 5 to 15 years in prison, and in a way he still does if he does not testify truthfully at the upcoming trial of the Trump Organization, which was charged with Weisselberg in this compensation scheme. The guilty plea from the former chief financial officer certainly implicates the company, and it could be very hard to defend the company against these charges when it comes time for trial in October.
So, Aaron, how could this guilty plea affect that upcoming October trial against the Trump Organization, and could it have an impact on that parallel state civil investigation?
Alan Weisselberg was instructed by both the prosecutor and the judge that he must testify truthfully at trial. He's already admitted to all of this fraudulent conduct, and he was charged right along with the company itself. So Weisselberg is going to have to give what the Manhattan District Attorney called important testimony at the upcoming trial of former President Trump's namesake company. But this does not include any cooperation agreement by Weisselberg to turn on Trump himself. Trump is being investigated as part of a wider criminal probe into his business dealings, and Weisselberg is not going to flip on him.
All right, got it. Aaron Katersky outside the Manhattan courthouse for us. Thanks, Aaron. And let's bring in ABC News contributor and host at the Law and Crime Network, Brian Buckmeyer, for more on this. Brian, what does this guilty plea by Weisselberg do for that upcoming trial? You heard Aaron say he now says he will have to testify in that trial and testify truthfully. So what does that mean for the Trump Organization?
Well, it means that the Trump Organization is going to have to combat the district attorney's star witness. This is a witness who has allocated to multiple counts of charges that is the connective tissue between his allegations of guilt and that of the Trump Organization. And so for the defense, how are you going to defend the Trump Organization when the CFO, the person probably more knowledgeable about the tax implications than anyone else in the organization, has already pled guilty and is now incriminating your client?
Now, Weisselberg did not agree to cooperate in the criminal case against Trump himself. So how vulnerable is the president without that cooperation?
It's degrees. If we're talking about a scale of 1 to 10, the full cooperation of Weisselberg might have been closer to a 9 or a 10, but not cooperating, but still pleading guilty and agreeing to testify. You're talking about somewhere around a 7. And so it's bad, but not as bad as it could be. The allocution, and that's the answering of those yes questions and going through what the charges are and then promising to testify. It's bad. It could be worse, but it's still bad.
I also want to ask you about this federal case. A judge in Florida is currently hearing arguments about whether to unseal the affidavit behind the Mar-a-Lago search. What would this affidavit tell us, and why would Trump and media organizations want it released?
All right, so an affidavit in its core is when law enforcement goes before a judge and swears or affirms under oath and provides probable cause and particularities. Particularities being, here is what we're looking for, here is what we'll find it, and this is how we got to that information. So these are the details of which the search warrant is predicated on, and this could go to who was in Mar-a-Lago at the time and saw these documents and saw how they were handled. Maybe they're talking about seeing the documents themselves, and so everyone wants them released because this gives us the full story, the full breadth of why this search warrant was allowed. It's kind of like looking at the judge's notes as to why he permitted it.
Now, what can we expect from today's hearing? What is the judge looking to learn today to make this decision of whether or not to unseal all or part of the affidavit?
This is going to be a huge balancing act, a balancing act between, on one side, the integrity of investigation, because a search warrant is the beginning. It's not the end. And the need for public interest to hear what is going on behind closed doors, because typically a search warrant isn't open to the public or even defense attorneys until after an arrest and an indictment. So to do it beforehand is very unprecedented, but considering the magnitude of this search warrant, it's understandable. Now, the devil's going to be in the details as to what is and what isn't redacted, because you can redact names, but if you say X was in Mar-a-Lago on Tuesday at 5 p.m., that simply allows everyone just to go back to the video and see who it was. And so you have to redact in a way that is protective of the investigation, but also gives the people enough information to legitimize a search warrant.
So where does this investigation go from here?
So the next step is who saw the documents? Who were they privy to? The kind of chain of custody that people have been talking about. Because at least for the purpose of the investigation for the 3 charges that were levied against the former president, whether or not those documents were confidential or secret is not really the issue. Now I think the investigation goes to what else occurred? Who saw these documents? How were they handled? Were they destroyed in any way? And so really it's about chain of custody and looking at those videos that were subpoenaed to see what in fact happened to these documents.
All right, Brian Buckmeyer, we appreciate your legal analysis as always. And we also wanted to say congratulations. I know you just welcomed a new baby boy. You look amazing. We were well rested, by the way, so I'm going to want all your secrets. But we wanted to give you a big hug through the screen and just say a huge congratulations.
Thank you very much for welcoming Reed to the world. We're so happy. And we'll go take a nap now.
Oh, I bet. All right, Brian, thanks again. And the CDC is now promising big changes after a scathing report about the agency's COVID-19 response. In a stunning admission, the CDC director is now calling this a watershed moment, saying, quote, "We are responsible for some pretty dramatic, pretty public mistakes." Elio Reshev has more.
The CDC director promising a major overhaul after a scathing internally initiated review found the agency repeatedly botched its response to the pandemic. In a statement, Dr. Rochelle Walensky putting it bluntly, our performance did not reliably meet expectations. In a message to staff viewed by ABC News, she went on to say, to be frank, we are responsible for some pretty dramatic, pretty public mistakes, from testing to data to communications. As an agency, even with all the terrific work we do, we still suffer the consequences from these mistakes. Walensky herself calling for that review, studying the CDC's handling of the pandemic during both this and the previous administration. It found the CDC's recommendations throughout the crisis, from masking to vaccines, confusing and overwhelming.
It's like contradicting. It's like a lot of stuff going on. Oh, don't do this, don't do that, and then we have to listen to both.
The director now vowing to implement major changes, including to the center's website, which the review said is not easy to navigate, as well as staffing shakeups and sharing information faster in plain language easy to understand. But as the CDC tries to move from tackling the COVID crisis to the rise of monkeypox, fresh criticism and concern that it took 3 months from the first diagnosed case in the U.S. for the agency to declare a public health emergency.
These key steps that they've laid out really are critical, especially in the face of this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, a continued spread of monkeypox in the United States, and also a recent identification of a polio case in New York. These things are just reminders that public health emergencies will continue to pop up, and CDC needs to be prepared.
And still no clear timeline for when the CDC plans to implement those sweeping changes, but there is a lot ahead, with cases of monkeypox in this country climbing to over 13,000. Diane?
Ariel Reshev, thanks for that. Coming up, millions of women use apps to track their reproductive health. Now a new report is revealing that some of those apps may not be as private as you think. How you can protect your information when we come back. Welcome back. A new report about some popular period tracking apps is raising privacy concerns. The apps collect and store some deeply personal information. And now a nonprofit is warning about potential privacy loopholes. Ariel Reshev has that story.
They're the apps millions of women use to track their fertility, pregnancies, and periods. Staff researchers at the Mozilla Foundation, a nonprofit that advocates for privacy on the internet, warning that the personal reproductive information you provide to these platforms, like weight, birth plan, pregnancy journals, or doctor's appointments, may not be as private as some want them to be.
And they're collecting a whole lot of data, and they're using very similar privacy policies to the apps you use for recipes or picture sharing or things like that.
The organization looked at 25 popular reproductive health apps, labeling 18 with a privacy not included warning, noting that the data you supply may not be secure, and saying that 8 failed to meet the company's minimum security standards. After Roe v. Wade was overturned earlier this year, many women wondering if they live in states where abortion has been limited or banned, if the data that they enter into apps about their reproductive health would be protected, or if it could be shared with brands, other apps, or even law enforcement.
What we found was most companies had fairly vague statements. That was hard to tell, whether companies would be voluntarily disclose data to law enforcement if they came asking.
Experts say it's up to each person to do their homework and read that fine print before signing off on privacy terms and entering potentially sensitive information online.
I think that each individual consumer has to do a cost-benefit analysis of how useful they find the product and the types of risk they may be exposed to depending on where they live. And I think that there are lots of products available that are ultimately very useful, very popular tools without exposing themselves to as much risk. So, for example, one that might store data locally on your phone or that doesn't participate in third-party data sharing.
All right, thanks to Ariel Reshev for that report. And I want to bring in board-certified OBGYN Dr. Jessica Shepard and senior national policy reporter Ann Flaherty for more on this. Thank you both for joining me. And I want to start with you. So many women use these apps. So what are the implications here?
So, Diane, I think there are huge implications. We are living in an era of concerns about our privacy. But, I think it's really important to point out that this is not unique to these period tracking apps. All of these apps collect information, sensitive information. Now, anti-abortion groups say that they don't want to criminalize women seeking abortion, that they want to go after the people around them who are helping them. But obviously, anytime that you have a private corporation or the government collecting information, sensitive information, like, a woman's cycle or her location or her date of birth, all of that becomes a concern because it helps the government and these corporations build a profile on the woman and potentially build a case against her.
Now, Dr. Shepard, can you walk us through the different reasons someone might use one of these apps?
Absolutely. These apps have been used for women for years now. When we think of their cycle, sexual activity, even things such as if they have abnormal periods and they really want to find a way to track them. So there are various uses for these apps. The most important part is that this is a health concern. And when women think of the apps and technology that they can use to help themselves with their reproductive health, these are important technology. But now we're looking at the concern of sharing that information when it's a very sensitive and private issue.
So, Ann, what info are these apps gleaning and storing from all of that, and how could that data then be used if it is sold?
So one of the biggest things, obviously, there's the, your name, your date of birth, but it's the location. It's where you are. Where do you work? Where do you go on the weekends? This is all information that companies like to collect about consumers, and then they sell it to other companies, for marketing purposes. So, of course, all of this information that they are collecting is also subject to law enforcement, and law enforcement can get warrants to get this information as well. So, again, it's not specific to these period tracking apps. If you're on a game, for example, and you're inside of an abortion clinic, that location data can go, to these companies, and they collect a very specific profile. I think it's also worth pointing out that even your shopping habits at the local pharmacy, that data also is collected. And there are companies out there that will merge all of this information to build a profile on you that can become very, very specific.
Now, Dr. Shepard, some of this information, it's so personal, it's so private. I mean, some people's partners might not even know some of the information that's being stored there. So what impact can it have on the individual to have this information out there?
Now, that has a great impact, because what we in the past is that there have been of charges that have been information shared on someone's pregnancy information and possibly abortion care that they need. So this is really go to now having, post Roe versus Wade, what this will really mean for someone to share their information in an intimate detail when it comes to their reproductive health, who's going to use that information and how it can be used against them. So I think that there are ways that we as consumers can look at that Privacy Act a little bit more, but I do think that these companies have a responsibility to change the way that they inform their consumers on what information is going to be shared, or it is not being third party, and what is the benefit for the patient to be sharing this information on the app itself.
Now, and Mozilla specifically raises the concern that since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, that data could be used by law enforcement. So how real is that concern, or is it just a hypothetical? And how would that work if it is?
So it's not just hypothetical. We have seen cases where this has been used, information has been used, gleaned online from law enforcement to build a case. So there's a recent case in Nebraska, for example, where a woman is being charged for helping her daughter get an abortion, and they used Facebook messages to build their case. So we know that there are aspects of this that this has long been an issue between law enforcement and privacy advocates that say they should be limited in the amount of information they can get from us online. But this is part of, if you're online, you are sharing your information.
All right, Ann Flaherty, Dr. Jessica Shepard, we appreciate it. Thank you. Coming up, the Good Samaritans springing into action to rescue a driver in a rollover crash. Stay with us. Welcome back to ABC News Live. Millions of Americans are on alert for extreme weather. New Mexico and Arizona are expecting more flash flooding after already getting up to 5 inches of rain in some parts. Meanwhile, record high temperatures and dry, gusty conditions are raising fire risks in the west. Good Samaritans came together to rescue a driver involved in a rollover crash in San Antonio, Texas. The group of 9 managed to flip the car upright. The driver is now recovering at the hospital. And thanks for joining us. I'm Diane Macedo. Stay with us as ABC News Live continues with more news, context, and analysis.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.